Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we will discuss about radius. Let's start. Radius. It is the lateral bone of forearm and it is homologous to medial bone of the leg of the tibia. Okay, we know in forearm there are two bones. One is radius, which lies laterally, and another one is ulna, which lies medially. Okay, so what are the parts? Radius is a typical long bone. So like other long bone, it has three parts, that is upper end, lower end, and intervening shaft. Now come to the anatomical points. Number 1, narrow disc shaped head is directed upward. The head is directed upward. The sharpest medial border is directed medially. This border is medial border, it is sharp and it is directed medially. And the stylet process at the lower end is directed laterally. This is stylet process and it will be located laterally. And in the lower end there is a lister tubercle. In the posterior surface of the lower end there is a lister tubercle. Okay, this is a lister tubercle. The lister tubercle located at the lower end and directed posteriorly. So what are the anatomical points? Number 1, head is disc shaped head, it is directed upwards. Medial sharp border is directed medially, and stylet process is directed laterally, and posterior lower end containing lister tubercle, which is directed posteriorly. Now come to the upper end. What are the parts in upper end? There is head, neck, and radial tuberosity. This is head, neck, and radial tuberosity. Now come to the head. Head is disc shaped and covered by hyaline cartilage. It is disc shaped and it is covered by hyaline cartilage, and it articulates with the capitulum of the humerus to form humeroradial joint. It is a part of radial joint. Then the circumference of the head is also smooth and it articulates medially with the radial notch of the ulna and form superior radio-ulnar joint, and this is a pivot type of synovial joint. Look at that, this circumference of the head of the radius is also articular and its medial end articulate with the radial notch of the ulna. This is the radial notch of the ulna. This is the radial notch of the ulna. This part is radial notch of the ulna. It articulates with the medial part of the head of the radius and forms superior radio-ulnar joint. This is a pivot type of synovial joint. Now come to the neck. Neck is a constricted part between head and radial tuberosity, and in neck there is a ligament is attached, that is quadrate ligament. The medial side of the neck is attached with a quadrate ligament. Now come to the radial tuberosity. This is radial tuberosity. Okay, its anterior surface is smooth and posterior part is rough. The posterior rough part, that is, here is the posterior view. The posterior rough part, here a muscle is inserted, that is the biceps brachii. The tendon of the biceps brachii is inserted in the posterior rough part of the deltoid tuberosity. Okay, and this anterior smooth part, it is covered by synovial bursa. Its anterior smooth part is covered by a synovial bursa and it keeps separated from the tendon of the biceps brachii. Now come to the shaft. Shaft has 3 border and 3 surfaces. The borders are anterior, posterior, and medial border. Now come to the anterior border. The anterior border starts from the anterolateral part of the radial tuberosity. This is radial tuberosity. So the anterior border starts from the anterolateral part of the radial tuberosity, then it goes downward and laterally, then it ends at the styloid process. So this is anterior border. Okay, and its upper part is oblique. You can see the upper part of the anterior border is oblique and lower part is vertical. The upper oblique part is called anterior oblique line, and this anterior oblique line gives attachment to the flexor digitorum superficialis muscle. Then come to the medial border. The medial border starts from the radial tuberosity and it ends at the posterior border of the ulnar notch. Look at that. The medial border starts from the radial tuberosity, it goes downward and it ends at the ulnar notch. And this part is called ulnar notch. Okay. So we previously told that medial border is the sharpest border. Okay. The medial border gives attachment to the interosseous membrane. Okay. Interosseous membrane is attached to the interosseous border or medial border to the lower 3/4 of it. That means lower 3/4 of the medial border or interosseous border gives attachment to interosseous membrane. Now come to the posterior border. This is the posterior view of the radius. The posterior border is not well defined. In the middle third it is sharp and it defined. Okay, the middle third of the posterior border is sharp and well defined, and above it a line runs upward and medially to the radial tuberosity. This is called posterior oblique line. So I'm telling it again, the posterior border is not well visualized, but its middle third is well defined, and above it there is a oblique line extending upward and medially towards the radial tuberosity. This is called posterior oblique line. Okay. Then come to the surfaces. What are the surfaces of the radius? There are three surfaces: anterior surface, posterior surface and lateral surface. The anterior surface is located between anterior and medial border. So this was anterior border, this was anterior border, and this was medial border. So this surface is anterior surface. And then come to the posterior surface. Posterior surface is located between posterior border and medial border. Okay. So we have to see in this picture between posterior border and medial border. This was posterior border, okay, and medial border was just like this. So I'm drawing it again. This was the posterior border, and this part is medial part. So this border was medial border. So this surface is posterior surface. The next surface is lateral surface. Lateral surface is located between anterior border and posterior border. So it will located like just this part. This part will be lateral border. It is not well visualized here. Okay. Then come to the lower end. The lower end of the radius has 5 surfaces. The lower end has 5 surfaces: anterior, posterior, medial, lateral and inferior surfaces. So this one will be the anterior surface, then posterior surface, this one will be lateral, this part will be the medial surface, and inferiorly there will be inferior surface. Okay, the posterior surface has a Lister tubercle. We have already shown you. Look at that. This tubercle is called lister tubercle. This part is called lister tubercle. And medial surface has ulnar notch. This medial surface has ulnar notch. This part is ulnar notch, by which the radius is attached with the ulna and form inferior radial ulnar joint. The inferior radio ulnar joint is another type of pivot type of synovial joint. Okay. And in the middle, look at that, both radius and ulna are covered by this white structure. This is called interosseous membrane. So this is called medial radio ulnar joint. Okay, so we can find radius and ulna, three type of joint. Above there was superior radio ulnar joint, middle there is medial radio ulnar joint, and at the inferior end there is inferior radio ulnar joint. And a lateral part, that means lateral surface of the lower end, has a process projection, that is stylet process. This part is called stylet process of the radius. And its inferior surface, you can see in its inferior surface, look at that, there is two area. One is quadrangular area and another one is triangular area. Look at that, this area is look like quadrangular and this is almost triangular in shape. So this quadrangular area articulates with the lunate bone. Lunate is one kind of carpal bone. So this quadrangular area of the inferior surface of the lower end articulate with the lunate bone, and this triangular area articulate with the scaphoid bone. Okay, and by joining with the scaphoid and lunate bone, it helps in formation of the wrist joint. Now come to the muscular attachment. What are the muscles attached to the radius? First come to the anterior surface. In its upper two-thirds, there is attachment of the flexor pollicis longus. Look at that. This in its upper two-thirds of the anterior surface, there is flexor pollicis longus. This muscle is flexor pollicis longus. And its lower one-third, there is insertion of the pronator quadratus. This blue area is pronator quadratus. In its middle part of the anterior surface, there is a nutrient foramen. The direction of this nutrient foramen is towards the upper end. So which end will be the growing end? The growing end is opposite to the direction of nutrient foramen. So in case of radius, the growing end will be towards the lower end. Okay. Now come to the lateral surface. In its upper one-third, and there is insertion of supinator muscle. This is supinator. In the just middle of the lateral border, there is insertion of the pronator teres, and the lower part of the lateral surface give insertion to the brachioradialis. Then come to the posterior surface. In the posterior surface, in the middle one-third, there is origin of the abductor pollicis longus. This is abductor pollicis longus, this muscle. And in its lower part, there is origin of the extensor pollicis brevis muscle. This is extensor pollicis brevis. Okay. There is no other muscle attached in the posterior surface. Then here is the picture of the relation of posterior surface of the lower end. Okay, we can see, we know that the posterior surface has a tubercle. This is called lister tubercle or dorsal tubercle. This is the tubercle. Okay, this is the tubercle. So just lateral to the tubercle there is attachment of the extensor carpi radialis brevis and extensor carpi radialis longus, these two muscles. And medial to the dorsal tubercle or listed tubercle there is attachment of the extensor pollicis longus tendon. Then medial to this there is extensor digiturm tendon, and medial to this there is extensor indicis tendon. Okay, these are the relationship of the posterior surface of the lower end. Now come to the ossification centers. The radius has 3 ossification centers, one for the shaft, one for upper end, and one for lower end. Among them, the shaft, the origin of the shaft is the only primary ossification center, and upper end and lower end arises from the secondary ossification center. Now come to the shaft. The shaft ossifies from a primary ossification center which appears during the 8th week of development. Then the lower end ossifies from a secondary ossification center which appears during the first year of life and fuses at 20 years of life. And it is the growing end of the bone. We have already seen in the anterior surface of the radius there was an nutrient pyramid and direction was upward. So the growing end was opposite to the direction of the nutrient pyramid, so that was the lower end. Okay, so lower end is the growing end of radius. Then upper end or head, which ossifies from a secondary ossification center which appears during the 4th year of life and fuses at 18 years. Now come to the clinical anatomy. The commonest site for the fracture of radius is within 2 cm of the distal end or lower end of the radius. That means the radius easily get fractured within 2 cm from the lower end of the radius. That means in this area. Okay. So when this fracture occurs, when we fall on an outstretched hand, this fracture easily occurs. Okay. So what will be the condition? When this fracture occurs, the fractured part is displaced upward and backward. This is called Colles fracture. Okay. And when this reverse of this situation is happened, this is called Smith fracture. That means it also occurs in the radius within 2 cm from its distal part or lower end, but here the displaced part is placed anteriorly. Okay, so this is called Smith fracture. It is just opposite to the Colles fracture. Then here another clinical anatomy, that is called pulled elbow. Okay, it occurs due to just subluxation of the head of the radius. We know around the head of the radius there is a annular ligament. When we pull a child with strongly and sudden, then this annular ligament is displaced from the head of the radius, this resulting subluxation of the joint. This is called pulled elbow. Now let's see. So this is Colles fracture. Look at that. The radius commonly gets fractured about 2 cm above its lower end. This is called Colles fracture. This occurs due to a fall on an outstretched hand, and the distal fragment is displayed upward and backward. Okay, so this is Colles fracture. When this distal fragment or fracture segment gets displaced anteriorly, that means reverse of this Colles fracture, this is called Smith fracture. Then what is pulled elbow? It is nothing but subluxation of the head of the radius. When there is a sudden powerful jerk on the hand of a child, may dislodge the head of the radius from the grip of the annular ligament. That means dislodgement of the head of the radius from its surrounding annular ligament causes subluxation of the head of the radius. This is called pulled elbow. From this clinical anatomy, this colli structure is frequently asked in the viva. Okay, what is colli structure, how it is, the mechanism of its, and its another name is dinner fork deformity. Okay, here the hand is look like a dinner fork. You can see typical dinner fork deformity. So that's it.